Psalm 130, verse 1. Out of the depths have I cried to you, O Lord. Hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplication. The state and condition of the soul here represented is a basis on which the process of the psalm is built, with its deportment, or the general acting of his faith in that state is expressed in the two first verses. Out of the depths have I cried to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. The present state of the soul under consideration is included in that expression, out of the depths. Some ancient expositors, as Chrysostom, suppose this expression relates to the depths of the heart of the psalmist, not from the mouth or tongue only, but from the depth and bottom of the heart, from the deepest recesses of the mind. And, indeed, the word is used to express the depths of the heart of men, but utterly in another sense. The heart is deep, Psalm 64, verse 6. But the obvious sense of the place, and a constant use of the word, will not admit of this interpretation. It is commonly used for valleys, or any deep places whatever, but especially of waters. Valleys and deep places, because of their darkness and solitariness, are accounted places of horror, helplessness, and trouble. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, Psalm 23, verse 4, that is, in the extremity of danger and trouble. The moral use of the word, as expressing the state and condition of the souls of men, is metaphorical. These depths, then, are difficulties or pressures, attended with fear, horror, danger, and trouble. And they are of two sorts. First, providential in respect of outward distresses, calamities, and afflictions. Save me, O God, for the waters are come into my soul. I stick in the mire of the deep, and there is no standing. I am come into the depths of waters, and the flood overflows me, Psalm 69, verses 1 and 2. It is trouble, and the extremity of it, that the psalmist complains of, and which he thus expresses. He was brought by it into a condition like to a man ready to be drowned, being cast into the bottom of deep and miry waters, where he had no firm foundation to stand upon nor ability to come out, as he further explains himself, verse 15. Number 2, there are internal depths, depths of conscience upon the account of sin. You have laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps, Psalm 88, verse 6. What he intends by this expression, the psalmist declares in the next words, your wrath lies hard upon me, verse 7. A sense of God's wrath upon his conscience, upon the account of sin, was a deep he was cast into. So speaking of the same manner, he says, I suffer your terrors, verse 15, and your fierce wrath goes over me, verse 16, which he calls water, waves, and deeps, according to the metaphor before opened. And these are the deeps that are here principally intended. He cries out under the weight and waves of his sins, says Augustine. This, the ensuing psalm makes evident, desiring to be delivered from these depths out of which he cried. He deals with God wholly about mercy and forgiveness, and it is sin done from which forgiveness is a deliverance. The doctrine also that he preaches upon his delivery is that of mercy, grace, and redemption. And this is manifest from the close of the psalm. And what we have deliverance by is most upon our hearts when we are delivered. It is true indeed that these deeps oftentimes concur as David speaks. Deep calls to deep, Psalm 42, verse 7. The deeps of affliction awaken the conscience to a deep sense of sin. But sin is a disease, affliction only a symptom of it. And in attending a cure, the disease itself is principally to be heeded. The symptom will follow or depart of itself. Many interpreters think that this was now David's condition, By great trouble and distress he was greatly minded of sin, and we must not therefore wholly pass over that intent of the word, though we are chiefly to respect that which he himself, in this address to God, did principally regard. This, in general, is the state and condition of the soul managed in this psalm, and is as the key to the ensuing discourse, or the hinge on which it turns. As to my intent, from the psalm, that which arises from this may be comprised in these two propositions. 1. Gracious souls, after much communion with God, may be brought into inextricable depths and entanglements on the account of sin. For such the psalmist here expresses his own condition to have been, and such he was. 2, the inward root of outward distresses is principally to be attended in all pressing trials, sin, and afflictions. Sin brings saints into the depths. Before I proceed at all, in the further opening up of the words, they having all of them respect to the proposition first laid down, I shall explain and confirm the truth contained in it, that so it may be understood what we say and what we affirm in the whole process of our discourse. It is a sad truth that we have proposed to consideration. He that hears it ought to tremble in himself, that he may rest in the day of trouble. It speaks out the apostle's advice, be not high-minded, but fear, Romans 11:20. And that also, let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12. When Peter had learned this truth by woeful experience, after all of his boldness and frowardness, he gives this counsel to all saints, that they would pass the time of their sojourning here in fear, 1 Peter 1, verse 17, knowing how near, in our greatest peace and serenity, evil and danger may lie at the door. Some few examples of the many that are left on record, in which this truth is exemplified, may be mentioned. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God, Genesis 6, verse 9. He did so a long season, and that in an evil time, amidst all sorts of temptations, when all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth, verse 12. This put an eminency upon his obedience, and doubtless rendered the communion which he had with God in walking before him most sweet and precious to him. He was a gracious soul, upon the redoubled testimony of God himself. But we know what befell this holy person. He that shall read the story that is recorded of him in Genesis 9, verses 20 to 27, will easily grant that he was brought into inextricable distress on the account of sin. His own drunkenness, verse 21, with the consequences of it, gives scandal to and provokes the unnatural lust of his son, verse 22. And this leads him to the devoting of that son and his posterity to destruction, verses 24 and 25. All which, joined with the sense of God's just indignation, from whom he had newly received that tremendously miraculous deliverance, must needs overwhelm him with sorrow and anxiety of spirit. The manner is more clear in David. Under the Old Testament, none loved God more than he. None was loved of God more than he. The paths of faith and love in which he walked are, to the most of us, like the way of an eagle in the air, too high and hard for us. Yet to this very day the cries of this man after God's own heart sound in our ears. Sometimes he complains of broken bones, sometimes of drowning depths, sometimes of waves and waterspouts, sometimes of wounds and diseases, sometimes of wrath and the sorrows of hell. Everywhere of his sins, the burden and the trouble of them. Some of the occasions of his depths, darkness, entanglements, and distresses we all know. As no man had more grace than he, so none is a greater instance of the power of sin, and the effects of his guilt upon the conscience than he. But examples of this kind are obvious, and occur to the thoughts of all, so that they need not to be repeated. I shall then show first What in particular is intended by the depths and entanglements on the account of sin, into which gracious souls, after much communion with God, may be cast? Secondly, from whence it comes to pass that so they may be, and that oftentimes so they are, experiencing the depths. For the first, some or all of these things following concur to the depths complained of: a loss of the sense of God's love, loss of the wanted sense of the love of God, which the soul did formerly enjoy. There is a twofold sense of the love of God in which believers in this world may be made partakers. There is a transient acting of the heart by the Holy Ghost with ravishing, unspeakable joys and apprehensions of God's love and our relation to Him in Christ. This, or the immediate effect of it, is called joy unspeakable and full of glory, 1 Peter 1, verse 8. The Holy Ghost shining into the heart with a clear evidence of the soul's interest in all gospel mercies causes it to leap for joy, to exult and triumph in the Lord, as being for a season carried above all sense and thought of sin, self, temptation, or trouble. But as God gives the bread of His house to all of His children, so these dainties and high cordials He reserves only for the seasons and persons in which, and to whom, He knows them to be needful and useful. Believers may be without this sense of love, and yet be in no depths. A man be strong and healthy as wholesome food, though he never drinks spirits and cordials. Again, there is an abiding dwelling sense of God's love upon the hearts of the most of those of whom we speak, who have had long communion with God, consisting in a prevailing gospel persuasion that they are accepted with God in Christ. Being justified by faith, we have peace with God, Romans 5, verse 1. I call it a prevailing persuasion, denoting both the opposition that is made to it by Satan and unbelief, and its efficacy in the conquest of it. This is a root from whence all that peace and ordinary consolation which believers in this world are made partakers of spring and grow. This is that which quickens and enlivens them to duty, Psalm 116, verses 12 and 13. And is the salt that renders their sacrifices and performances savory to God, and refreshing to themselves. This supports them under their trials, gives them peace, hope, and comfort in life and death. Though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, Psalm 23, verse 4. A sense of God's presence and love is sufficient to rebuke all anxiety and fears in the worst and most dreadful condition. And not only so, but to give, in the midst of them, solid consolation and joy. So the prophet expresses it in Habakkuk 3, verses 17 and 18. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the pines, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the field shall yield no meat. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and therefore shall be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. And this is that sense of love which the choicest believers may lose on the account of sin. This is one step into their depths. They shall not retain any such gospel apprehension of it, as that it should give them rest, peace, or consolation, that it should influence their souls with delight in duty or support in trial. And the nature of this will be afterward more fully explained. Conscious of one's ungratefulness to God. Perplexed thoughtfulness about the great and wretched unkindness towards God is another part of the depths of sin-entangled souls. So David complains, I remembered God, and was troubled. How comes the remembrance of God to be to him a matter of trouble? In other places he professes that it was all of his relief and support. How comes it to be an occasion of his trouble? All had not been well between God and him, and whereas formerly, in his remembrance of God, his thoughts were chiefly exercised about his love and kindness, now they were wholly possessed with his own sin and unkindness. This causes his trouble. In this lies a share of the entanglements occasioned by sin. Says such a soul in itself, foolish creature, have you thus requited the Lord? In this the return that you have made to him for all of his love, his kindness, his consolations and mercies? Is this your kindness for him, your love to him? Is this your kindness to your friend? Is this your boasting of him that you had found so much goodness and excellency in him and his love, that though all man should forsake him, you never would do so? Or all your promises, all your engagements which you made to God in times of distress, upon prevailing obligations and mighty impressions of his good spirit upon your soul, now come to this, that you should so foolishly forget, neglect, despise, and cast him off? Well, now he is gone. He is withdrawn from you. And what will you do? Are you not even ashamed to desire him to return? They were thoughts of this nature that cut Peter to the heart upon his fall. The soul finds them cruel as death and strong as the grave. It is bound in the chains of them and cannot be comforted. Psalm 38, verses 3 to 6. And in this consists a great part of the depths inquired after. For this consideration excites and puts an edge upon all grieving, straightening, perplexing affections, which are the only means in which the soul of a man may be inwardly troubled, or trouble itself. Such are sorrow and shame, with that self-aversion and revenge in which they are attended, and as their reason and object in this case transcend all other occasions of them, so on no other account did they cause such severe and perplexing reflections on the soul as on this. Old wounds reopened. A revived sense of justly deserved wrath belongs also to these depths. This is as the opening of old wounds, when men have passed through a sense of wrath and have attained deliverance and rest through the blood of Christ, to come to their old thoughts again, to be trading afresh with hell, curse, law, and wrath. It is a depth indeed, and this often befalls gracious souls on the account of sin. Your wrath lies hard upon me, says Heman. It pressed and crushed him sorely. There is a self-judgingness to the desert of wrath which is consistent with a comforting persuasion of an interest in Christ. This the soul finds sweetness in, as it lies in a subserviency to the exaltation of grace. But in this case the soul is left under it without that relief. It plunges itself into the curse of the law and flames of hell, without any cheering support from the blood of Christ. This is walking in the valley of the shadow of death. The soul converses with death, and what seems to lie in a tendency to it. The Lord also, to increase his perplexities, puts new life and spirit into the law, gives it a fresh commission, as it were, to take such a one into its custody, and the law will never in this world be lacking to its duty, overwhelmed by affliction and sin. Oppressing apprehensions of temporal judgments concur in this also, for God will judge his people, and judgment often begins at the house of God. Though God says such a one should not cast me off forever, though he should pardon my iniquities, yet he may so take vengeance of my inventions as to make me feed on gall and wormwood all my days. David says, my flesh trembles for fear of you, and I am afraid of your judgments. Psalm 119, verse 120. He knows not what the great God may bring upon him, and being full of a sense of the guilt of sin, which is the bottom of this whole condition, every judgment of God is full of terror to him. Sometimes he thinks God may lay open the filth of his heart, and make him a scandal and a reproach in the world. Oh, he says, do not make me a reproach to the foolish. Psalm 39, verse 8. Sometimes he trembles lest God should strike him suddenly with some signal judgment, and take him out of the world in darkness and sorrow. So David says, do not take me away in your wrath. Sometimes he fears lest he shall be like Jonah and raise a storm in his family, in the church in which he is a member, or in the whole nation. Let them not be ashamed for my sake. These things make his heart soft, as Job speaks, and to melt within him. When any affliction or public judgment of God is fastened to a living sense of sin in the conscience, it overwhelms the soul, whether it be only justly feared or be actually inflicted, as was the case of Joseph's brethren in Egypt. The soul is enrolled from one deep to another. Sense of sin casts it on the consideration of its affliction, and affliction turns it back on a sense of its sin. So deep calls to deep, and all God's billows go over the soul, and they do each of them make the soul tender and sharpen its sense to the other. Affliction softens the soul, so that the sense of sin cuts the deeper and makes the larger wounds, and the sense of sin weakens the soul and makes affliction sit the heavier, and so increases its burden. In this case, that affliction which a man in his usual state of spiritual peace could have embraced as a sweet pledge of love, is as goads and thorns in the side, depriving him of all rest and quietness. God makes it as thorns and briars in which he will teach stubborn souls their duty, as Gideon did the men of Succoth. Next, fear of being a reprobate at the last day. There may be added to this prevailing fears for a season of being utterly rejected by God, and of being found a reprobate at the last day. Jonah seems to conclude so. Then I said, I am cast out of your sight. Jonah 2 verse 4. I am lost forever. God will own me no more. And Heman says, I am counted with them that go down into the pit, free among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, and they are cut off from your hand. Psalm 88, verses 4 and 5. This may reach the soul until the sorrows of hell encompass it and lay hold upon it, until it be deprived of comfort, peace, rest, until it be a terror to itself and be ready to choose strangling rather than life. This may befall a gracious soul on the account of sin. But yet, because this fights directly against the life of faith, God does not, unless it be in extraordinary cases, allow any of us to lie too long in this horrible pit, where there is no water, no refreshment. But this often falls out, that even the saints themselves are left for a season to a fearful expectation of judgment and fiery indignation as to the prevailing apprehension of their minds. Next, disconsolate under God's rebuke. God secretly sends his arrows into the soul. They wound and gall it, adding pain, trouble, and disquietness to its disconsolation. Your arrows stick fast in me, and your hand presses me sore. Psalm 38, verse 2. Ever and anon in his walking, God shot a sharp, piercing arrow, fixing it in his soul, that galled, wounded, and perplexed him, filling him with pain and grievous vexation. These arrows are God's rebukes. When with rebukes the correct man for iniquity, Psalm 39, verse 11. God speaks in his word and by his Spirit in the conscience, things sharp and bitter to the soul, fasten him so as it cannot shake them out. These Job so mournfully complains of in Job 6, verse 4. The Lord speaks words with that efficacy that they pierce a heart quite through. And what the issue then is, David declares. There is no soundness, he says, in my flesh because of your anger, nor is there any rest in my bones because of my sin. Psalm 38, verse 3. The whole person is brought under the power of them, and all health and rest is taken away. Next, lack of zeal, unspiritedness, and disability to duty, in doing or suffering, attend such a condition. Mine iniquities have taken hold upon me, so that I am not able to look up. Psalm 40, verse 12. His spiritual strength was worn away by sin, so that he was not able to address himself to any communion with God. The soul now cannot pray with life and power, cannot hear with joy and profit, cannot do good and communicate with cheerfulness and freedom, cannot meditate with delight and heavenly mindedness, cannot act for God with zeal and liberty, cannot think of suffering with boldness and resolution, but is sick, weak, feeble, and bowed down. Now, I say, a gracious soul, after much communion with God, may, on the account of sin, by a sense of the guilt of it, be brought into a state and condition in which some, more, or all of these, with other like perplexities, may be his portion, and these make up the depths of which the psalmist here complains. What are the sins, or of what sorts, that ordinarily cast the souls of believers into these depths shall be afterwards declared. Secondly, I shall now show both whence it is that believers may fall into such a condition, and also whence it is that oftentimes they actually do so. First, the nature of the covenant in which all believers now walk with God, and in which all their whole provision for obedience is enwrapped, leaves it possible for them to fall into these depths that have been mentioned. Under the first covenant, there was no mercy or forgiveness provided for any sin. It was necessary, then, that it should exhibit a sufficiency of grace to preserve them from every sin, or it could have been of no use at all. This the righteousness of God required, and so it was. To have made a covenant in which there was no provision at all of pardon, and not a sufficiency of grace to keep the covenanters from need of pardon, was not answerable to the goodness and righteousness of God. But he made man upright, who of his own accord sought out many inventions. It is not so in the covenant of grace. There is in it pardon provided in the blood of Christ. It is not therefore of indispensable necessity that there should be administered in it grace effectually preserving from every sin. Yet it is on all accounts to be preferred before the other. For besides a relief by pardon which the other knew nothing of, there is in it also much provision against sin which was not in the other. Now no sin can void the covenant. There is provision made in it against all and every sin that would disannul the covenant, and make a final separation between God and the soul that has been once taken into the bond of it. This provision is absolute. God has taken upon himself the making of this good, and he establishing this law of the covenant, that it shall not by sin be disannulled. I will, God says, make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from them to do them good, but I will put my fear in their hearts that they shall not depart from me, Jeremiah 32, verse 40. The security of this depends not on anything in ourselves. All that is in us is to be used as a means of the accomplishment of this promise, but the event or issue depends absolutely on the faithfulness of God, and the whole certainty and stability of the covenant depends on the efficacy of the grace administered in it to preserve men from all such sins that would disannul it. Constant peace and consolation. There is in this covenant provision made for constant peace and consolation, notwithstanding and against the guilt of such sins as, through their infirmities and temptations, believers are daily exposed to. Though they fall into sins every day, yet they do not fall into depths every day. In the tenor of this covenant there is a consistency between a sense of sin to humiliation and peace, with strong consolation. After the apostle had described the whole conflict that believers have with sin, and the frequent wounds which they receive thereby, which makes them cry out for deliverance, Romans 7, verse 24, yet he concludes that there is no condemnation to them, Romans 8, verse 1, which is the sufficient and stable foundation of peace. So the things I write to you, that you do not sin. And if any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous, 1 John 2, verse 1. Our great business and care ought to be that we do not sin. But yet, when we have done our utmost, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. What then shall poor, sinful, guilty creatures do? Why, let them go to the Father by their advocate, and they shall not fail of pardon and peace. And Paul says, God is abundantly willing that we might have strong consolation who fly for refuge to lay hold on the hope set before us, Hebrews 6, verses 17 and 18. What was his condition who fled out of the old city of refuge for safety, from whence this expression is taken? He was guilty of blood, though shed at unawares, and so as that he was to die for it. He did not escape to the city of refuge. Though we may have the guilt of sins upon us that the law pronounces death, too, yet flying to Christ for refuge, God has provided not only safety but strong consolation for us also. Forgiveness in the blood of Christ does not only take guilt away from the soul only, but trouble also from the conscience. And in this respect does the apostle at large set forth the excellency of his sacrifice, Hebrews 10. The sacrifices of the old law, he tells us, could not make perfect the worshippers, Hebrews 10:1, which he proves in Hebrews 10, verse 2, because they never did take away, thoroughly and really, conscience of sin, that is, its depths or distresses of conscience about sin. But now, he says, Jesus Christ and the covenant of grace is perfected forever them that are sanctified, Hebrews 10, verse 14. Providing for them such stable peace and consolation as that they shall not need the renewing of sacrifices every day, Hebrews 10:18. This is a great mystery of the gospel and the blood of Christ, that those who sin every day should have peace with God all their days, provided their sins fall within the compass of those infirmities into which this consolation is provided. Preservation from ruinous sins. There is provision made of grace to prevent and preserve the soul from great and enormous sins, such as in their own nature are apt to wound the conscience, and cast a person into such depths and entanglements as that in which he shall neither have rest nor peace. Of what sort these sins are shall be afterward declared. There is in this covenant grace for grace, John 1:16, an abundance of grace administered from the all fullness of Christ. Grace reigns in it, destroying and crucifying the body of sin, Romans 6, verse 6. But this provision in the covenant of grace against peace-ruining, soul-perplexing sins is not, as to the administration of it, absolute. There are covenant commands and exhortations on the attendance, whereunto the administration of much covenant grace depends, to watch, pray, improve faith, to stand on our guard continually, to mortify sin, to fight against temptations with steadfastness, diligence, constancy, are everywhere prescribed to us, and that in order to the insurance of the grace mentioned. These things are on our part the condition of the administration of that abundant grace which is to preserve us from soul-entangling sins. So Peter informs us, the divine power of God is given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, 2 Peter 1, verse 3. We have from it an habitual furnishment and provision for obedience at all times. Also, he says, he has given to us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these we might be partakers of the divine nature. Verse 4. What, then, is in this blessed state and condition required of us, that we may make a due improvement of the provision made for us and enjoy the comforting influence of those promises that he prescribes to us, giving all diligence, and to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. Verses 5 to 7. That is, carefully and diligently attend to the exercise of all the graces of the Spirit, and to a conversation in all things becoming the gospel. What then shall be the end of these things if they are attended to? Here lies the latitude of the new covenant. Here lies the exercise of renewed free will. This is the field of free voluntary obedience under the administration of gospel grace. There are extremes which, in respect of the event, is not concerned in. To be wholly perfect, to be free from every sin, all failings, all infirmities, that is not provided for, nor promised in this covenant. It is the covenant of mercy and pardon which opposes the continuance of sin. to fall utterly and finally from God, that is absolutely provided against. Between these two extremes of absolute perfection and total apostasy lies the large field of believers' obedience and walking with God. Many a sweet heavenly passage there is, and many a dangerous depth in this field. Some walk near to the one side, some to the other. Yea, some person may sometimes press hard after perfection, sometimes be cast to the very border of destruction. Now between these two lie many a soul-plunging sin, against which no absolute provision is made, and which, for lack of all diligence to put the means of preservation in practice, believers are oftentimes overtaken with. Their unregeneracy. Thus, though there be in the covenant of grace through Jesus Christ provision made of abundant supplies for the soul's preservation from entangling sins, yet their administration has respect to our diligent attendance to the means of receiving them appointed for us to walk in.